Okay, can I check that you can hear me?
Yep.
I think there's a okay, there is no echo anymore. 1 second. Hopefully you can still hear me. Let me hide self view. PI is in the chat. How would this be done? I think this is quite straightforward. If I'm not mistaken, this has been done in Singapore with quite good results so far. So firstly, when buying housing, it has to represent like the area in which you buy a house has to be made up out of a certain percentage. You probably have like which represents and is proportional with the ethnic makeup of that country, right? So if there are 40% people of, I don't know, Arab origin, then you probably have 40% of Arab people in neighborhoods, then 20% of people of Asian descent, and 40% white people of, or whichever is the ethnic outline of that country. In terms of old neighborhoods and what you do with them, if they're historically white or historically Arab, you probably provide incentives for people to move to more ethnically diverse neighborhoods in order to meet up these proportions. Secondly, if that doesn't work, you probably go through a state agency that helps you move. You receive compensation for loss of value in case you have to move to an apartment that is more expensive or cheaper than the one that you were owning before. In terms of new neighborhoods, probably when you build them, you set these percentages and you don't let people move in when that cap is reached, and you wait for other people to come in. I'll take you in a second. You wait for other people to come in until the percentage is fulfilled. I'm happy to take the clarification.
The motion says requires, which means it is mandatory. You cannot give an incentive. You must move people by force if necessary if they don't consent.
Yeah, the model just explained that there are several steps, right? You financially incentivize them. If they're not happy with that, you help them. They have to move, but you help them through the agency. This is fine. And I want to preempt this. Obviously, there's a trade. Op will say there is a trade-off with choice, right? Because you should get to be able to choose where you live. To be clear, you don't really have much of a choice to live anyways. It's not like you choose necessarily to live in the neighborhood where the most people are Arabs, just like you're mostly drawn there, and you have to choose there because that's the only way you get housing, because otherwise the people who sell you the house would refuse to sell you in a white neighborhood. Op will try to claim that you choose where you live. I don't think you really choose to. I think that this is a measure that equalizes the choice, even if it's somewhat restricted for everybody. It actually allows more choice, because as a white person you can always choose where to live. As an Arab person, you very rarely get to, because you're usually confined to the ethnic neighborhood because other people wouldn't sell. Strategically, rich minorities might move to better neighborhoods than the poor minorities, but they're still comparatively poorer than the majority, the white majority in that area. And the poor majorities might move to worse neighborhoods, but they're still comparatively richer. So you have an equalizing of the kind of accumulated wealth of the neighborhoods. And this comes in crucial in the first economic argument. So the premise here is simple. The neighborhood you live in is the prerequisite for wealth accumulation and moving up the social ladder. Yes, surely short term, the market will shift a bit. There might be some imbalances, but crucially long term, ethnic neighborhoods would have been severely more disenfranchised. I'm happy to take the short term, maybe unclarity, as long as long term you have more equalizing of opportunities. So why is your neighborhood the primary means of wealth accumulation? One, it influences how much your house costs, right? Market fluctuations, if you own your house, allow you to have a lot of assets behind. Secondly, you're able to use your apartment, if you own it, as a collateral to get a loan, for example, which means the better neighborhood you live in, the better loans you're able to get. Thirdly, in terms of transport and how much and how well your neighborhood is connected to other areas of your city, it gives you access to services or to jobs further away. Fourthly, it gives you access to better schools of education. Note, white people or the rich majority in those cities usually get access to all of these things, whereas minorities never do, because they're very rarely considered electorally relevant. What happens like long term or medium term, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, when you equalize them? Again, happy to take the trade-off. Why specifically living together helps with networking, for example? One, because you probably fight together with your neighbors for projects pertaining to, I don't know, having something new done in your neighborhood or having a project pass with the local municipality. Secondly, you grow up, your children grow up with people from diverse ethnic backgrounds. You see announcements for job in a neighborhood that is, you know, more diverse. There's more wealthy people, so more announcements are likely to be announced on the walls in your neighborhood. You have companies move there because there's, you know, more diverse set of skills because now it's more diversified, so you get easier access to more jobs. But secondly, this is not-contingent on anything. You get better access to healthcare and education. I think this is crucial, panel. They're funded by local money, even if not completely, at least partially funded by local money. The reason why white neighborhoods in America have better schools and better healthcare is because all of the taxes of the people living in a neighborhood go to the school district in that neighborhood. So basically, they just cater to themselves, which means that when you equalize them and you have people of different wealth coming in, the richer ethnic category brings extra taxes, and it benefits everyone that moves into that neighborhood, which means obviously that they get access to better schools. That might mean better school in terms of prestige, that might be better schools in terms of they have more labs, which obviously is one of the main wealth building tools when you apply for university or when you apply to a job and say, look, I have this set of skills that I learned in school, which is comparatively better for, I don't know, 80% of the people living in that neighborhood compared to the other ethnic neighborhood they would have lived in. Secondly, in terms of healthcare, better equipped hospitals, which means that you're less likely to die of an infection, or you can access healthcare more quickly, which means that your illness doesn't get worse and you don't have to pay for a lot of meds to take care of it. You actually get to treat it early on in your life. Thirdly, in terms of social aid, again, a lot of times funded at least partially by local money, which means that even if you're the worst of minority in that neighborhood, you're better to access more stamps, right? Because you now don't have to fight your entire neighborhood for the food stamps, but you can access them. There's likely to be, you know, better paying food stamps because there's more money per aggregate in your neighborhood. So irrespective of backlash, irrespective of whether or not you get along with your children or with your neighbors, you are able to access basic needs, which I think is primary to most people and should be prioritized in this debate as an intuition pump. This is, which means that I'm happy to trade off some micro-discrimination if this breaks the deadlock of poverty and allows better access to improving your situation. This is also relevant politically, right? Because you cannot anymore create slums that you electorally ignore, as politicians do a lot of times. Now, they have to cater to most neighborhoods equally, because each neighborhood will have 40% of rich majority and 40% of electorally relevant, at least 40% of electorally relevant minorities. So they do have to cater. OG.
Great. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for those very fine remarks. I'd now like to invite the Leader of Opposition to speak and open the Opposition Senate Council case. Here.
Everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Two things in the speech. Firstly, why this disrupts people's lives in the short run, and secondly, why this is just generally bad for people's quality of life in the long run. Rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, why is this incredibly disruptive to people's lives in the short run? Note that in order for the motion to work, opening government has to stand over forcibly relocating multiple people. They cannot soft prop this and say, oh, we might allow some like tax incentives for people to move. They have to require people to move. And even though they say the word help, I think this does just look like forced relocation. It does look like government agents showing up to your house and telling you that you have a certain amount of days to leave your household and move to an entirely new neighborhood. I think this forcible relocation is incredibly disruptive to people's lives for two reasons. Firstly, I think you just lose access to a community that is incredibly important to you. Note that often these communities tend to be very concentrated with one individual ethnic group, are very valuable to that ethnic group for a variety of reasons. You have community ties. You feel safe leaving your children playing out in the front yard while you cook, because you know that everyone around you is a neighbor and everyone around you is a friend who you've known and grown up with for an extended period of time. There's a high degree of trust that means you are able to like leave your children there for childcare while you go work your job, and you are better able to function as a human being. Secondly, though, often you just live in certain areas because they suit your skill set, and they suit the skill sets that you have in order for you to do your job, i.e. certain people who are farmers who have skills in farming and very little else are likely to live in agricultural areas. Certain people who are fishermen who have skills in fishing and very little else are likely to live close to the ocean or close to a lake where they can go fishing. As a consequence, I think on the comparative, you are moved away from an area where you have access to something that you literally need in order to do your job. Finally, you often settle in culturally relevant areas, right? Note that in certain religions, i.e. like Orthodox Jews will often live close to a synagogue because they're not allowed to like work or drive a car on Shabbos, and consequently they need to be proximate to a synagogue in order for them to like engage in weekly ritual that is incredibly important to them. I think that when you settle in a culturally relevant, when you are moved, you are forced out of a culturally relevant area. This means you have to walk far longer to get to your church or to your synagogue. I think on their side of the house, people lose this community and are unable to access a variety of benefits that it brings to them. Secondly, I think this is a fairly severe impact, right? Insofar as it means people lose their job, they lose a community that enables them to do a variety of things. They lose access to like portions of their religious identity. I think this is a very severe harm that affects everyone who's moved out of these neighborhoods, but also people who stay in the neighborhood, right? Because they feel as though their family or their friends have left, and their neighborhood is now a foreign place where new people who they've never met are moving in. Secondly, in societies with ethnic tensions, because I don't just think that this happens in places where people are fairly peaceable, I think this leads to outright violent clashes. I think majority groups who live in these regions or other ethnic groups are often frustrated that members of their group have been moved out. They see people from the ethnic group that is their rival in the homes of their friends and family, and they perceive this as an invasion. These groups have often been systematically dehumanized to them prior during conflicts as vermin. They likely see this as an infestation of people who they consider barely human. I think what this means is that you're likely to get like outright violence and clashes in certain neighborhoods where there are likely to be ethnic tensions. I think this is very severe, right? Note that GovBench can't just say, oh, this is backlash, this doesn't really have a delta. I would note that this does have a delta insofar as when you are shot or when you are stabbed, that is something that is fairly important to you and fairly negatively affects your quality of life insofar as you've just been injured. I think this is a very severe harm that government have to stand over. Secondly, why is this bad for the quality of life long run? Because even if the moves are like peaceable in the short run, I think long run this creates a variety of problems that make it substantially harder for ethnic minorities to live. What open governments say is that, the comparative is that they live in slums. But I would note that sometimes it is actually preferable for them to live in a slum than for them to be surrounded by members of another ethnic group or members of a wealthier group who turn their noses down on them and don't perceive them as equals, right? Because note that often ethnic groups don't exist in like even proportions, right? It's not 50% Black people and 50% white people in the United States of America. Often the groups tend to be concentrated in certain regions, and this concentration tends to be quite good for them for two reasons. Firstly, it provides political representation for them. I think this means that they are able to like elect local governments or elect local mayors or elect at least one representative that will represent them and their interests nationally when they live in the same neighborhood, and that neighborhood is counted as a constituency. This means you're more likely to get your religious holidays made public holidays. You're less likely to get anti-burqa laws passed in certain regions of France. Comparatively, what government essentially do is gerrymander entire districts and mean that you have 30% of one smaller ethnic minority living within that group, and the rest of the 70% are the majority group. I think the problem here is that the majority group is likely to always win out insofar as they're numerically the majority. As a consequence, the voices of these ethnic minorities tend to get drowned out, and they lose access to any political capital at all, and nobody caters to them. Secondly, though, I think often living in a concentrated area is good insofar as it provides you insulation from oppression. You are unlikely to face discrimination at the employment level when every single other person living in that neighborhood and working in the bakeries and the shops is also part of your ethnic group and also likely knows and trusts you. You are unlikely to be bullied in school if every other person in your public school is also a Black kid from the inner city. I think this is substantially better because it means there's a level playing field and you're able to access certain opportunities that you're likely to be discriminated out of in wealthier regions. I'll take a POI from CG. OG.
Yeah, I don't think the forced moving of people works. The way this usually works is the way it's done in Singapore. You provide public housing schemes to minorities outside the neighborhood. You move the minorities in, you don't move the majority out. That's a crazy case.
Yeah, so I think it's probably also bad if these minorities are like on the outskirts of the neighborhoods that you're moving them into. I think this generally, I think this reifies inequalities and often adapts in fairly exclusionary ways. I.e., you have a neighborhood where the inner part of the neighborhood is a very wealthy place, but the outer part of it are slums where you have poorer people living there. I think this makes it impossible for any of opening governments like contact theory arguments to accrue, insofar as you likely have very little interaction between these two groups. I think you often can't afford the prices and the property values within the wealthier region. You often feel unsafe. You can't go to these nice schools, to nice private schools, insofar as wealthy people are likely to adapt to create like a variety of private services that replace public services that they see as having been contaminated. I think in the long run, a variety of problems get substantially worse. You have far more gerrymandering. Ethnic minorities are less able to politically exercise their voices, and they're more likely to be oppressed and discriminated against at the point in time where they are the minority in a very, very large group of people who are hostile to them even existing there, proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition, for those very fine remarks. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to speak and continue OG's case. You're here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Unfortunately, I'm not smart enough or have a good enough memory to actually quote MLK, but he had a quote that essentially said that until the means of capitalism and wealth production are not in the hands of Black people, they're never going to escape their oppression. Because the main tool through which you're actually oppressed is the economy, is the wealth that is being distributed in an unfair advantage. This has been the case since the entirety of history, and we are slowly progressing towards more and more economic equity. But until you're able to live in neighborhoods that are actually allowing you to build wealth, this is impossible. That's why the lack of interaction with our mechanization loses the debate. So let's see what they provided. I'm going to have two major clashes, the short and the long term, and I'm going to try to weigh them if I have time. So firstly, on the short term, they say that there's a forced relocation. And here I want to be very clear on the model. Yes, eventually, if people don't want to move, we are going to move them. But this will obviously take a few years, right? If anything, you have a shipping bottleneck of like people can't move their couches around. So like UPS needs some time in order for them to move everyone around the city or around the country, right? So this does take some time. We do provide financial incentives if you're willing to like move without us having to do anything. But if you don't, we will eventually relocate you. And here the main point that they have is that the areas will suit you really well because you have very specific skill sets of fishing or farming. Firstly, I had to look it up because I'm like ESL, but neighborhood generally refers to like more urban areas rather than rural areas where you have a very specific skill set. That means that on like average, most of the people that we're talking about actually have skills like doing paperwork or a very specific type of corporate job. But even if that isn't the case, let's see which is more common. Are you living in the region that you're living in because you have a very unique skill set that can only be exploited in your specific neighborhood? Or is it more likely that you are there because of gerrymandering and redlining? I think that the second one is more likely because of historical reasons that are like the main precondition for all of these natural consequences that we currently have. What this shows to you is that this argument of like some people don't get jobs is quite minimal compared to people who can move to areas where they can access significantly higher job opportunities. If that is the weighing, then you should weigh for OG. Secondarily, I think that you are likely to reskill to a significant degree because you now have the access to wealth building tools that give you the stability in order for you to reskill. These are things such as one, better education that my colleague talked about and was uninteracted with, or two, the security of knowing that you have a home that actually increases in value. So like that means you have like you can take debt against it and so on. But the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the short term is whether we are legitimate to force you to move, because CEO also put a POI on this. They seem to be very keen on the argument. So note, if OpBench only cares about agency, I would posit that communities can take aggregate decisions on whether they want to move or not. Because note, some people are going to move away from their neighborhood, some people will stay. The decision still leaves up to the individual, and the community takes aggregate decision, and they decide whether they want to move if they're incentivized by the financial incentives that we give or the better neighborhood that they would go to. So some people just willingly choose to move. So the delta on like I'm forced out of my house is actually quite minimal. there's very few people that would be actively forced to move. They are more likely going to benefit from financial incentives or the better lifestyle that they would access to these neighborhoods. But let's take the up bench at their best. Some people are forced to move. I think that this is legitimate nonetheless, because when we take decisions as a state, especially when we take long-term decisions, we can't access the preferences of the people in the future. So what we do is that we access and prioritize the likely preferences of the people in the future. So we don't know if the people in the future would like to not die of climate change, but we presume that they would, because it's very intuitive for us that they would. This is how we take decisions, and thus in the present we try to make decisions that would protect the people from climate change in the future. Similarly, the fact that you receive financial benefits transfer to the most basic of rights that you can access, and we think that it's intuitive that even minorities that enjoy their community would prefer to have food on the table and for their children to go to school as a precondition for them to access anything else in this capitalistic society. So even if some people are forced to do it, we think that this is a fair and legitimate decision by the state, because it accesses what the people would generally want to access if they would be in this position 20 years from now. Before I can move on to the long term, I can take so.
You don't prove why this integration will be successful. It doesn't matter.
I don't have to, because I'm not playing the game of like people are gonna get along with each other. I can take CG and let them do it, but we chose not to do it for a reason, because we don't want to face the whole backlash scenario. Note, all of our mechanisms have nothing to do with you understanding your neighbors or caring about them. Even if there is some level of discrimination, which I'm going to interact with now, we don't care, because our mechanisms are purely economic and there's nothing you can do about them, even if you try to discriminate against your neighbors. So let's actually interact with the point on ethnic tensions. Quick mitigation, I think that the police still exists and they're likely to prevent a lot of these ethnic tensions, mostly because now they have to protect the majority of the population that is actually politically relevant. So they don't want to have violence in their neighborhood, no matter what that neighborhood is. But even regardless of this mitigation, I think it's still preferable for us to do this motion, because the main push from OO is that we are going to have insulation from oppression. Oppression happens very often in very, how should I call them, covert cases. So the main push from OP is the short-term harms would be experienced right now, but the short-term harms would be experienced anyway, because when you try to get a job or move up the social ladder, you are likely to be oppressed and likely to be discriminated against at the job offering, or even be called racial slurs for attempting to move out of your caste. Secondarily, I think you are more likely to experience indirect state-driven discrimination through lack of funding, lack of healthcare, or actual displacement and being moved to even poorer areas. So the delta on short-term discrimination doesn't play out for OP. It plays out negatively for OP, because realistically you are likely to be discriminated against by the state anyway. Yes, there might be more direct discrimination, but realistically the quality of life doesn't fundamentally shift, because you would have been oppressed anyway. But our benefits are more certain because they're insulated from externalities. One, nobody can take this away from you. They can't move you out of this place now that you have established that this is your home and you are now the minority that needs to be represented in the community. It's really hard for them to move you out. Secondarily, your position in the community is solidified in time, because then you do have contact theory, you do agree with your neighbors. But even if you don't, the third reason why you should vote for us is that the long-term benefits are more important than any short-term detriments, because they allow you the ability to defend yourself, because generally you now get access to the economic benefits that allow you to then become politically active, to vote for yourself, or even just the economic benefits that insulate you from all of the harms of discrimination. A clear OG win.
Great, thank you very much, DPM, for those very fun remarks. And now to close the opening half, I'd like to invite the dialogue to speak. Here.
Great. For my speech, I would prefer if you offered POIs in the chat. What Proposition does is force the parents of Bosnian boys who were killed in Srebrenica only a couple decades ago to live next to Serbs, to force Tigrays in Ethiopia who are currently being genocided to live next to the people who are killing them. This is a morally disgusting idea. I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, can the process of relocation be successful? Secondly, will it lead to successful integration and an increase of opportunities? And thirdly, weighing violence and degrees of security. On the question of feasibility, both prop teams try and say, guys, it worked in Singapore. Singapore is a very unique political case. It is the smallest country in the world, or one of them. It is rich, and ethnic groups hate each other substantially less. Singapore is very different to how Ethiopia looks under the status quo. Then Tin says in a PLI, guys, we're just going to move the majority into the minority communities. This doesn't work if you think about how population demographics actually look. Think about a country like Nigeria, where you have the predominantly Muslim North and the predominantly Christian South. In a case like this, you're going to have to move both groups to equalized proportions, and even just moving the majority group is going to have a bunch of harms. What did we tell you? The process of relocation is morally disgusting because if people don't take caste transfers, the state will have to forcibly do this, and you uproot people from communities that they care deeply, deeply about and that are very important to their quality of life. These are the ice cream shops that they went to as a kid that they love deeply. They often love their friends. They love their communities. It's near the church that they grew up going to. That's very, very important to their religion, and that's couched in very significant memories for them. The only response that we get to this is to say, but people don't really choose to live in their communities under the status quo, so agency violation is symmetric. This is nonsense for a couple of reasons. Firstly, even if you don't choose your community under the status quo, it still acquires a high level of significance for you, because this is where you formed your memories. This is the community that you grew to care about, so it becomes morally significant. But secondly, choice is obviously way higher under our side of the house, right? Like, sure, there's some factors that constrain your options, but in tuition pump, many communities have diversified under the status quo. The middle belt of Nigeria is very, very ethnically diverse, right? There's all things like migrant workers that exist. If you're really unhappy, you can move. And I would also posit that we probably have quite a lot of fiat power under our side of the house. We could say that if people are really unhappy, we would invest the tens of millions of social resources that are going to be used in forced relocation to offer people the option of moving if you're deeply unhappy, so we can still access choice within that regard. So we approve under this theme. This will go badly, and it's morally disgusting to uproot people from their communities. Secondly, let's talk about the process of integration. I want to explain why the perception of the majority is going to be very negative, and then I'm going to impact this. Firstly, there is a reason why groups hate each other in the first place. Artificial ethnic divides were created by colonial powers in order to reify their powers in deep-seated ways where you were socialized to perceive other groups as being vermin. This often led to tremendous conflict and genocide, right? Think about Rwanda. Think about the kind of violence that occurred throughout Yugoslavia. These are literally people that you perceived as killing you, killing your families, and you don't have to live alongside them. But secondly, even if you don't hate the group initially, resentment grows when you perceive the group that is coming in as pushing out your community and your family that you care deeply about. Even if it's the state and not the group, this is the most direct way in order to direct a variety of degrees of blame. Why does this negative perception mean that integration is never going to be successful? Firstly, all public services that opening government is talking about, even if they are public, still rely on a favorable perception of the dominant group. What if an Indian doctor refuses to see a young Muslim boy when he's dying in a hospital? What if teachers refuse to answer the questions of ethnic minorities in their class or ever write these kind of recommendations? To get a job, you still need the majority being willing to hire you in the first place. Public services still depend on high degrees of private buy-in to actually be effective, especially when you often have things like lower income and worse credentials that are going to reify negative images that exist. They can say that social contact theory works as interaction happens, but if you have such a negative initial perception, it has a reinforcing anchoring effect rather than actually deconstruct these biases. Secondly, large amounts of services in these communities are still privatized. This is not just the West where everything is public, right? A lot of the time, we don't have these well-funded, nice public schools. We have private schools, we have private hospitals, right? Not only are you going to be financially precluded from accessing these services, which Daniela analyzes, this is the exact same problem as gentrification under the status quo, where if you have rich people moving into poor communities and you increase prices, people are unable to afford these kind of things in their income brackets. Discrimination means that you can't access these services regardless. How on earth can you get a job as a poor person in a rich community when you don't even have the CV to be able to do this? Private services are also inaccessible. But next, you also get things like community-based segregation happening internally. You get the dominant privileged ethnic group around the city core and the poor communities on the outskirts, meaning that there's still segregation when it comes to things like the kind of schools that you are going to. Why is this less important than violence and bodily security? Firstly, on exclusivity of the impact, there's other ways to promote things like uplifting of poor communities, right? We can get things like state investment, and we have some fiat to do that. Often there's incentives for governments to do things like invest, because if you are a concentrated region, you have some political influence in first past the post systems where you don't want every single Muslim province not to vote for you, right? You can also get things like private investment, which are often more blind to ethnicity. You can be a Chinese country, but Chinese businesses can still see your region as being profitable. Secondly, on extremity of impact, the degree of inequality in your region is going to be very, very small, whereas violence increase will be large. Closing government.
Opening.
You do realize that these places tend to be the most underdeveloped parts of cities. Why the fuck would a private investor go and put his money there?
Because if you're underdeveloped, what does this mean? More potential for capital appreciation and for future flows that are going to exist. Often you can still have things like resources that exist in these communities. Some Kurdish communities, for instance, have quite a lot of oil that's existing. Let's chat about violence. We gave you multiple reasons about basic protections being violated. Firstly, the nature of communal skirmishes during the process of forced relocations. Panel, think about what happened during partition. A group who just genocided you is moving into your community. A civil wars often just happen. A probability of violence frames your economics argument because you got things like infrastructure destruction. But secondly, it's about violence within these communities and the forfeiting of basic protection. We explain this in the realm of things like cultural protection, where at the very least you have a local level government that respects your language rights, that respects your religious rights, that does not forcibly indoctrinate you within the context of education. But it's also about physical protection. They say the police, this is offensive. The police in India watched as the Babri mosque was being destroyed. They're often also not ethnically existing in proportion. They don't care. This is about protecting people who can otherwise be genocided and killed by ethnic oppressors who hate them, who can otherwise have things like fenced communities. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, DLO, for those very fine remarks. To start the second half of the debate, I'd like to invite member of government to speak. Here.
Yep. Am I visible and audible?
Yep.
Cool. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition bench needs a common sense check. First, on this forcible relocation thing. Notice that for all of the reasons opposition talks about, it's very likely going to be politically unpalatable to forcibly move people. This means the government has an incentive to find ways around that. Most often, they already point out in a POI, this is done through public housing schemes, which are targeted at minorities who in the status quo live in disenfranchised neighborhoods, and because they do, they are likely to accept the opportunity to move to a better location with better education, better healthcare, which the government is giving them for free, which means that in most cases, you're moving the minorities in as opposed to moving the majority out, and the minority has incentives to accept that as opposed to be angry about that. The only response the DLO gives is Nigeria. This is not analysis. Secondly, I want to talk about integration, but before that, I just want to point out one thing. It's uncharitable for opening opposition to set this debate in the worst possible excesses. This motion probably doesn't happen if a civil war happened yesterday. Because if a civil war happened yesterday, you probably don't have institutions, you don't have a constitution, there is no parliament to even pass this policy. This probably happens 20 years after the Balkan Wars, not one day after Srebrenica. Opening opposition cannot set their case in that way, and yes, it's pronounced Srebrenica if you want to run that example. Now on integration. Note, most people in most countries, and all debates are debated in the vast majority of cases, aren't racists. And even in Bosnia, most people don't have a family member in Srebrenica. Most often, resentment between groups is caused by the fact that groups do not interact with each other. At the point where you don't interact with a stranger, it's very easy for populists and right-wingers to paint them as alien, to paint them as different, to paint them as not wanting to integrate into the culture and being a threat to the culture. What happens when you have these people interacting with each other in neighborhoods is that you see that they're just normal people who also go to the store, who also go to work, who take their kids to the park. In other words, You directly disprove the populist theories. A very good example of this is football. A lot of football fans are racist, but racial violence tended to decrease amongst football fans at the point where players from other minorities joined the team, where they would also kiss the badge, when they would also score goals for that team, which show that they have the same goals, the same values, they live their life in the same way and care about the same things. Therefore, something must be wrong about the previous theory I had. And even if it's not a conscious process, it's subconscious. But let's engage with the worst case scenario. Like this is Yugoslavia and people were killed and everybody's incredibly angry and all these kinds of things. Reconciliation works transgenerationally. Even if you don't have reconciliation within the first generation, you can have it with the second generation. Because children are born a priori to political narratives. They don't understand them, they don't care about them. But what they understand is that this guy plays football with them after school. What they do understand is that this guy helped them with his math homework. It doesn't matter whether his name is then Ahmed or is Jovan or is Marco. They're all doing the same thing. They're all kids. They're all having fun. And over time, you begin to not care about those things. Notice how the Croatian and Serbian debate community are very close, despite the fact that all of our fathers and grandfathers have been to the war. Notice this happens transgeneration in a lot of other cases as well. When JFK desegregated schools in America, the first couple of years, he literally had to send the federal army to the southern states to enforce it. Now, black kids and white kids go to school normally. Why? Because over time, things become normalized in backlash ways. Anger is a transient emotion. So even if we take opening opposition at their best, they get harms in the short term. We can flip those harms in the long term by creating integration. The problem with their case is uncomparative, because where these people live today is equally bad. They're equally discriminated and equally underinvested in. So I'm not sure what their comparative is. They're just subjecting them to a different form of violence and different form of people not caring about them. We can flip that. Now, how do we flip that? I think this is where it's important to engage in where these people live today, because open government assumes that their status quo is bad and then crafts the comparative. They have better opportunities, blah, blah. But an opening opposition comes and says, but no, it's something's very good to live concentrated. Who wins that clash? Closing government. Why? Because we're going to characterize how those places look and how their lives look in the status quo. Firstly, even if they do have employment in those areas, it's very often menial labor that pays incredibly low. Also very often in the gray economy, which means you're not eligible for credit or collateral if you want to have any form of vertical mobility. You often also don't learn transferable skills which you can put on your CV to get a job elsewhere. Secondly, if you're in an ethnic enclave like Chinatown or the banlieues of Marseille, you don't have an incentive to learn the language, which means that you and your children cannot access any form of mobility outside of that neighborhood, which seems to be opposite of what opposition cares about if they really care about choice. But thirdly, these areas are fundamentally underinvested in, which is to say the capital amelioration that Naomi talks about is least likely in those neighborhoods. There's a lack of infrastructure there, and we're talking about the basics. We're talking about sewage, we're talking about garbage removal, we're talking about literal streetlights. Why? Because there's a self-reinforcing mechanism. There is a perception that these people don't want to integrate. They don't want to live with us. They don't want to try and make an effort. Why should we then pump our money into their neighborhoods? And then it takes a further step at the point where those neighborhoods do become dilapidated, at the point where visually, yes, they are less developed and they are more worn down than other neighborhoods. This creates a visual association with poverty, with crime. It makes people even less likely to want to invest in those neighborhoods, which means that in the status quo, they already live horribly, but also those who live outside those areas are associated with those same negative associations and subject to the same violence that opposition seems to care about. Before I explain why it becomes comparative on our side, something opening government doesn't do, I'll take opening opposition.
Kids listen to what their parents tell them. Why do Indians and Muslims still hate each other years after partitions? And even if biases decrease on your side, they don't when people are now invading your community.
Because of proximate experiences, if I'm a 7-year-old kid, I know my dad is angry at the news when watching them and stuff like this. But what I care about more is my friend who is proximate to me and who causes me positive emotions, as opposed to a narrative which tells me stories which I then see are not true practically when I go to school and stuff like this. What is the comparison? The comparison is that people now have incentives to access opportunities that exist. And they do. NGOs that provide training and stuff like that, but they don't have those incentives when they are concentrated in those enclaves. But secondly, this is incredibly key, the state is now structurally likely to provide these people with training for employment, with IT literacy programs, with language learning. Why? Because if opposition is correct about the backlash point, then the state has an incentive to prove that this policy makes sense, to deliver results on the policy. To do that, they need to make sure that these people are going to get employed, that they're going to have work, which means this only exists if the state forces itself into a position where it has to do this, which also proves that they're more likely to integrate. The last thing they say is political representation. 4 things here. First of all, it's marginal. Even if you get a single representative in a city council, he has very little political power against the entire council. People also probably don't want to associate with them, given my enclave's point. Secondly, you still have to cater to minorities, because for some reason opposition assumes that majorities vote homogeneously. No, not all white people vote the same. Some vote one left left-wing party, some vote another left-wing party, some vote right-wing, which means minority votes can still be kingmakers. Thirdly, minority representation is in most of these countries already constitutionally mandated for the very post-conflict reason opposition talks about. Lawmakers know that there's been a history of ethnic conflict, so they've included the mandatory representation of minorities into parliaments to prevent conflict in the future. This actually happens in Croatia, where we have a Serbian representative. But lastly, this point is uncomparative in half of electoral systems, but not all systems are first past the post. So the political representation thing is incredibly marginal coming from opposition. What isn't marginal is we remove people from current status quo, which is horrible. Even if this change is marginal, the status quo is so horrible that the marginal change must be waited for closing government.
All right. Thank you very much, Member of Parliament, for those very fine remarks. Now, I'd like to invite the Member of Opposition to speak next. Here.
I'm audible, right?
Yep.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Closing opposition is going to be the first team that proves that xenophobia and racism are not a short-term transit problem, but something that structurally reignites itself over and over, and it gets worse over time. Secondly, we're going to prove why you are significantly reducing the purchasing power and the land value that people in those communities had, which made them cope with the economical unfortunate realities that they lived in, which is going to directly clash with closing government. On to the first extension. The CG response is that the contact theory, basically, they're going to get better over time. So the only thing that we have to prove to take out OG and CG is that your racist parents are not going to allow you to begin with foreign friendships with Black people. They're not going to allow you to get attention in school because the teachers are racist, and you're going to be going to the schools that are the most, in kindergartens that are the most defunded because you're the poorest in that particular region. This is the only burden we have to prove. Why is this structurally true? Actual analysis, not intuition, comes about historical examples relative to opening opposition. The first reason is that people have a natural inclination to be xenophobic. I want to headline this very carefully. Not all people are racist. They have the opportunity to be racist. That is to say, for the vast majority of our evolution, we have lived in small tribes in which we have differentiated ourselves through facial features, like the skin that you have on your face, the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, the facial features that you have. It was a sign of trust, and comparatively, people that are facially and physically different to you were seen as distrustful, as different, and people that you shouldn't distrust. The second reason is just simply politically exogenous factors that exacerbate and take advantage of that natural inclination towards racism. There are two primary factors that happen. The first is the natural incentive of every political state to form a national identity through patriotism and nationalism. In the vast majority of cases, the easiest way for you to form a narrative is to cater to the majority. In the vast majority of countries like India and America, this caters to the dominant ethnical majority, which in many cases whitewashes or actively discriminates or creates negative beliefs towards the minority. Because for you to be a great nation and a great ethnicity, like white-collar Americans, you must be comparatively better than other ethnicities, which is why the glorification of a particular ethnicity in a nation comes comparatively at the expense and the discrimination against other ethnicities. The second reason is that there are a lot of media and political incentives from demagogues and political leaders to actively reignite racial tensions and to use them as a political platform. Because either A, you are already exploiting a natural psychological inclination of people, like fear-mongering for migrants, like using racist stereotypes that Black people are welfare queens that are draining away the budget of the state. This is an easy way to channel the negative emotions of people and to get votes. But secondly, it's a comparatively better option for you to get votes instead of having actual critiques for your political platform and engage in elaborate political policy in which you can lose if your policy is not based on facts. Those are reasons as to why racism does not go down in any way. It only goes up, which directly clashes with the characterization from opening government and closing government. And I want to make this crucial. Contact theory works only if you are willing to charitably engage in contact to begin with. If you are a racist and you experience this particular policy, the likely narrative that is going to be weaponized by the dominant political establishment is going to be those people are invading your neighborhoods. You have to sabotage this particular policy. You have to actively rebel against this type of policy. And especially if they invade your neighborhoods, this also reduces the likelihood, as per the analysis of closing government, to give them training, to give them more resources. They have already received the right and privilege to live within your neighborhood. Why would you fucking give them more? This is the first extension. The second extension has to purely do with economical discrimination. The first premise is that in many cases, the average wage of different ethnicities within countries is vastly different. This is just trivially true. The average wage for a South African white man is $40,000. For a black man, it's 6 times less. The average wage for a white American color worker is 70 fucking thousand. For a black man, it's barely 30 fucking thousand. What are the structural reasons behind this? There are 3. The first of which, if people are naturally xenophobic and there is an inclination for you to be racist, you attach negative work labels to those particular ethnicities. This is why black people are seen as uncivilized and aggressive, thus they're not fit for high-paying corporate jobs. They're seen as lazy, as welfare queens, and in many cases you have an incentive to portray them in that particular way, thus hiring them becomes risky. The second reason is that workplaces become ethnical echo chambers over the long term. This is why the most high-paying jobs within South Africa, within India, and within America are all dominated by the dominant ethnicity that is culturally homogeneous and is not willing to allow other people to enter. But thirdly, even if racism gets better over time, the previous historical disadvantage remains. You cannot get into a high-paying jobs if you don't have connections to going to university, if you weren't in a private schools to get achievements, if your poor black parents were poor, you're comparatively likely to be historically disadvantaged, and this is an intergenerational economical harm in that particular way. Why is this crucial? 3 reasons as to why those people are unable now to cope. They were previously able to cope within their communities economically and are now unable to do so. The first of which, the costs of living are significantly going up, because previously those communities were culturally homogeneous, meaning each one of them on average had roughly the same purchasing power. Thus, supermarkets that give you basic utilities, the prices of electricity and water, the prices for the school utensils of your child were roughly like in accordance in a way that would maximize profits from companies. Thus, they were comparatively cheaper. Now, if you introduce other ethnicities that we have proven have much more purchasing power and are comparatively richer, this means that the prices for everyone are going up, because you can hijack the prices, ensure profits from the rich minority, and then force other people to adapt and go into starvation. Before I continue, opening.
When your wealth goes up, you can isolate against marginal increase of discrimination. You take a cab, you put up a fence. Salary discrepancy decreases as per OG mechanisms. Gentrification is symmetrical. It usually happens when they're not diverse.
I genuinely don't understand this. I'm sorry, I don't understand. A lot of buzzwords, I don't understand it. Secondly, property prices are going up. In the status quo, there isn't a lot of demand for you to live in culturally homogeneous communities of certain ethnicities that are low paid, meaning the prices of your mortgage, the prices of your rent, and the prices upon which you buy the property is going down. And in many cases, racial stereotypes are actually something positive for those communities when they're buying properties. Because if the neighborhood is associated, racially speaking, with crime, the prices are going down and they are staying down, which makes it much more likely for people to be better able to cope. Now that there is more demand for you to be buying properties, and the rich people are buying properties in those particular regions, the overall bidding process and demand goes up. This is the same reason as to why, like, Americans are currently outpriced by corporations that are willing to pay much more to buy out properties in their neighborhood that are previously established. On all those grounds, it's certain, irrespective of political considerations, that people must be able to meet their basic necessities. This is the only way for them to retain ability to economically cope in disadvantaged regions. On all those grounds, oppose.
Great, thank you very much, Member of Opposition, for those very kind remarks. Now I'd like to invite the government whip to speak next. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. I reject this characterization coming from opposition bench that is actually quite insulting, that most people are racist inherently and that most people are inherently evil. I reject the characterization that just because my father fought Serbs in Yugoslavia war, I inherently have to hate Serbs because of all of the previous ethnic tensions and stuff like this. I would like to characterize that most people are good people. Most people have basic human empathy. When they see someone, they are not focused on the color of their skin, but they're focused on that this person has empathy, has emotions, has experiences just like I do. This is what we are uniquely bringing to you from Closing Government. This is what I'm going to mostly be focusing on my speech. And this is also the reason why we are extending over the opening government, because the contact theory that Tin is talking about, which they reject as unimportant clash, very explicitly in deputy. The contact theory is logically prior to opening government's case about climbing socioeconomic ladder, because as per the opposition's bench analysis, just because you're proximate to jobs and schools and opportunities doesn't mean you are able to access them if there is racism that opposition talks about, which is a clash that opening government never swiftly engages with it. This is why our extension comes logically prior to them. I want to engage in this clash. Firstly, just a couple of intuitions and couple of strategic observations. If opposition bench is right, then progressivism is literally impossible. Yet we have seen historical changes. Yes, we have seen that Serbs and Croats are able to hang out together and live together and all these sorts of things, which means that this is something that if you gut check this is something that is not empirically true. But secondly, what is the comparative on their side of the house? Okay, maybe you feel, better about yourself being surrounded by all of the people from your minorities, but then you live in a fucking enclave. This is what they're implicitly conceding is comparative on their side of the house. You're living in enclave, which is horrible because you're getting zero state funding, you are not getting any kind of investments and all these kinds of things. But if you look historically, just because our parents and grandparents, just because they were very homophobic, for example, but we are not, because we were able to interact with people who have different experiences from us. We are able to share some stories with them, we are able to empathize with them, and we are able to understand that the narratives that we have been fed are not true. Secondly, notice that closing opposition is hinging their mechanism on nationalism. But I would like to posit counter-characterization, which is basically that this is not something that is true. There are a very strong political incentives of states, especially states that are very, heterogeneous and that come from post-conflict era, to be, to not promote xenophobia and to promote peace and stuff like this. There are a couple of structural reasons for this. Firstly, you don't want ethnic tensions. It's not convenient for you that within your state people are, killing each other and all these sorts of things. Secondly, there are trade and these are countries that tend to be very often geographically proximate to each other. So for example, and this is why you are trading with each other, you are also, you have to, talk about geopolitical issues. You need this type of diplomatic cooperation and all these sorts of things, which means that they do have an incentive to be good to each other and stuff like this. This is why Vučić, for example, who is a Serbian president, has been donating money to Croatia, and we had very good relations and all these sorts of things. But thirdly, if this policy is done by a state and there is a obvious threat of backlash and violence and all these sorts of things, which is something that state wants to avoid, obviously, this is they're probably going to try to sell this in a good way and do this in a good way in order to avoid this and all these sorts of things. Secondly, CEO says that you need charitable, in order for our extension to work, you need charitable engagement amongst each other. Firstly, I already proved to you why this is possible. Most people aren't fucking racist, and this biological argument about how you are scared of people who look different from you, this has been disproven in many studies, so it's not really true. But also we don't, so we proved to you that there is going to be charitable engagement. But I want to talk more about this, because you don't necessarily need, the most charitable engagement ever. For example, if you have a company and you need labor, you do not care what the color of their skin is, you just care about them being able to do good work and stuff like this. So because of the capitalistic incentives, you are going to be employing them. Secondly, you also probably do care about, you also children, for example, they're not discriminating as a parent who is and as a parent you are going to have to have this black child at home with you because they have some work school project together and all these sorts of things, which means that there are going to be natural ways of how people are going to merge together, you're going to church together and all these sorts of things. Now onto the opening opposition, but before that, POI from them.
You complain about the status quo, but you don't explain why they can get opportunities in new areas when they are poor, and there are deep-seated colonial otherized identities with anchoring effects we explained before, CO. If economics is bad regardless, we get basic cultural protection from local level representation.
So what we are explaining to you is that when you go to the city or something like this, you inherently have to, go to school there, which is a better school. You inherently have to, get employed by someone who is, who is there because they need someone who you are going to work for and all these kinds of things. But also when it comes to the political representation and stuff like this, I think TIN deals with this already. Firstly, minorities tend to very often be protected by the constitution and by the laws because you want to avoid further ethnic tensions. but also secondly, because they do, because they are, to some extent large political, but also we are able to flip this argument, because once you are increasing the empathy and all these sorts of things, then white people are going to care about minorities and are going to be starting to vote on their issues as well, and all these sorts of things. And I believe that the India example that Naomi talks about is an isolated example, given the fact that like right now they have conflicts over Kashmir. So this is not something that was just years ago. Right now they have conflicts. This is why like Muslim and Indians, this is different. But also, I also want to talk about how I also want to talk about more onto the opening opposition, because like when they're talking about how you're going to lose access to important community and like the person that sold you ice cream when you were young and stuff like this is not a reason. Like people move every single fucking day and they move on. Like Naomi, you moved 7 times already. Like it's fine. Like you can just like move on with your life and stuff like this. But also secondly, we tell you that like they're going to be, like building synagogues and all these sorts of things. So you are going to be able to have access to these sorts of things. And also you are probably going to have people from your, like minority groups and all these sorts of things that you're going to be able to interact with and stuff like this. And then we're talking about backlash and all these sorts of things. I already deal with this, but I don't think that backlash is going to happen in the long term on the large scale, given the fact that like even if like it happens short termly, this is something that has to happen. Like JFK literally had to send a fucking army when segregation of school ended, but this is something that was necessary to do in order for society to progress both.
Thank you very much, Government, for those very fine remarks. And to close the debate, opposition whip, please. Here.
Hi, I presume you can hear me?
Yep.
Amazing. POIs in chat. I will take one from opening. Can you make telephone? Again, just. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Our case, the majority of it, is not even dependent on us proving integration, because it's highly questionable. We give you the reasons why it won't happen, but the crux of the case is not dependent on this. It's purely economical fact that once you have from people from different wealth groups, price manipulation cannot happen. Currently, shops, corporations have a profit incentive to manipulate the price in different regions. This is to say, certain neighborhoods get the same product for cheaper price because people cannot afford it either way. When you have a mix of those groups in one place, you cater to the ones who are paying the most because it maximizes your profit incentive. Meaning, now there are no places where poor people can go to get cheap products, where they can get cheap rent, because everywhere the level has risen up, right? Because you cater to the people who are more likely to pay you more. This does not depend on even if people are racist or not, because it's just how the market works. This crucially makes people less able to protect themselves, to have to work 3 jobs, to have to be able to literally be on the street or eat less because they can afford the expensive fucking food in the neighborhood. That's what our case is. Don't let them mislead you. Firstly, on CG, they say, oh, but our Croatian parents don't predetermine our fate, blah, blah, blah. If you think about it, neither team but on the short diagonal gives you structural reasons why people are likely to not be racist. They intuition pump it with a fucking 1,000 examples, but the analysis there is not present. Team maybe gives one piece of analysis that we'll engage with later, but their response to our case is just, I don't accept this narrative that people are racist. This is just intuition. They literally say, good, check this. But where is the analysis? I would like to see it. They say, the evolution argument has been disproven. This is one part out of our 4 mechanisms as to why people are getting more racist over time. They don't engage with our analysis on why nationalism exacerbates racism in a way that benefits politicians. They don't engage with the fact that polarization benefits medias and political parties, because the more hatred you feel, the more likely you're to click on a bad article or to vote passionately for that party who are being racist, who are trying to say, you fear the people stealing your job, we want to help you. They don't engage with this, and they should have, because this analysis predetermines everything in this debate. It predetermines whether or not integration could happen. It predetermines whether or not you can make use of those fancy fancy schools and integration programs that they talk about. More structurally though, what do they say? Firstly, that this is likely to be public housing. 3 reasons why this is not the case. One, it's just a very unpopular policy to do in the first place. Why is this the case? One, properties in the area will lose their value if you're able to house a lot of people in one place for a cheaper price. That's why rich landlords who get passive income from renting out their multiple apartments, or the real estate lobby, would not allow for this to happen. Secondly, it's just too expensive. You have to build the building, you have to hire staff, you have to maintain it constantly, meaning the state has too high of a cost for a benefit that is not even certain. Integration is highly uncertain. You are not willing to do this. But lastly, you don't have a political gain to do this. Those people don't vote because they don't have the time or because they're not politically engaged. Therefore, if you do the policy well, you don't benefit as a politician because no one cares about this. Now, secondly, on integration. One, they say, but in the best case scenario, they explain that kids who are like not racist right now will integrate with other kids. But again, this is asserted. Why? One, kids don't interact with one another constantly. Biser explains to you that your parents will literally not allow you to play with the other kid at the background if they are themselves racist, which we prove. But secondly, even in the best case, where you are in school and you're untouched by your parents, there are a lot of segregation based on like friend groups, right? You split with your friends who you already know. When you see the new kid coming in, you won't integrate them in that case. Even in the long term, this might get better. They don't prove it gets better. If it initially doesn't work, I don't know why it will work in the long run. But secondly, about parents, note, they give the example of football, right, that you integrate with them. But this happens because the footballers talk to each other 40 hours a week. You see your neighbors for 5 minutes in the store. Why does this lead to integration? Why does this mean you understand their stories? Why does it mean you're now changing your voter preferences to advocate for them? No analysis whatsoever. Now, on OG, I want to pose it to, they say, our arguments are completely not hinged on the integration, but that is bullshit, as it's pointed out by other teams in the case. Meaning, you having access to good schools depends on teachers not being racist to you, and it depends on people actively being able to help you and advocate for you. They say, but you get more food stamps. This is dependent on people actively being okay with their taxes being redistributed to you, which they don't prove. Now, what is the problem with their case? Generally, they say at the best case, you get some skills because you go to a good school. Why won't those schools and services be good to you? One, teachers will just not pay attention to you. Either in the worst case where they are racist and they don't think you deserve this attention, but secondly, in the best case, they physically cannot pay attention to you because the discrepancy between the levels of preparedness within students is very different. Some kids have been in prep school their entire lives, and then you get some black kids who had shitty teachers beforehand. That's why you won't be able to pay attention to them. But lastly, parents lobby for the white kids to get the attentions of the teachers, otherwise they pull out their donations or their funding. Comparatively, teachers do a lot of charitable charity things where they go to poorer regions to feel like they're bringing value. This is the solvency. OG.
Gentrification actually happens in non-diverse neighborhoods now. When it gets diverse, no one wants violence because their own house value would decrease if it's seen as dangerous.
No, if you wanted to respond to all absurd arguments about violence, sure. We do not argue violence. We just explain that people will not accept you and won't give you the opportunities that you talk about. I'm not sure why this is so hard to understand. Now, comparing with OO, I want to weigh out a few things. Why is money and having the ability to pay for yourself the most important thing? One, it gives you solvency over the long run. The way people solve their problems as a minority is when they can actively collectivize and are able to argue for their stuff. But you can't go to protest because you have to work now 2 jobs as opposed to 1 to keep up with the high expensive rent you have in your area. You can't, for example, donate and save up money because now all of your money goes to just getting your groceries every week. Even if that seems insignificant at first, it piles up to the point that it's so expensive that you can't do those things. Secondly, you have to cut costs. You eat less food, you can't concentrate, you're less productive because you can't fucking afford it. Why is this more important than all? One, note that their arguments are unproven to the point at which they don't prove why ethnic tensions happens. Their principle is based on practical, but the most important thing is money predetermined self-expression, which they defend, because when you have the money, you can donate, you can go to church, you can build it up. I'm very happy to fucking report.
Great. Thank you very much, Opposition Whip, for those very fine remarks. That is the end of the debate. So thank you very much for what was a really, really high quality debate. And good luck, everyone, for the breaks silent round. So your